China is now providing more emergency rescue financing than the IMF. We're at stage 4 of a 5-stage hostile takeover. Picture the boardroom at the People's Bank of China, November 2023. Screens display 31 active currency swap agreements worth $550 billion, more emergency liquidity capacity than the IMF deployed in the entire previous decade. The next screen shows something more important: debt restructuring negotiations for Sri Lanka, Zambia, Pakistan. In each case, China holds veto power, one signature away from port lease extensions, resource purchase commitments, UN voting alignment. The mechanism is elegant: lend to countries beyond their capacity to repay. Wait for the crisis, offer immediate refinancing, extract governance. The question isn't if China displaces the IMF as lender of last resort. It's whether US policymakers notice they've already lost the voting bloc before the next quota reallocation vote. That vote is 18 months out. This is stage 1, overextension. Here's why this matters to you. When the IMF loses its monopoly on emergency lending, the dollar loses the enforcement mechanism that keeps it as the global reserve currency. That reserve currency premium is worth roughly $800 billion annually in lower borrowing costs. Money that funds everything from Social Security to defense spending without raising your taxes. The IMF balance sheet looks like a regional bank trying to backstop a global financial system. Total lending capacity: $650 billion via quota subscriptions. Outstanding global emerging market debt: over $100 trillion. That's a 0.65% coverage ratio. And the distressed asset dynamics work like this. The IMF can only lend what member countries contribute via quota subscriptions. The last major quota increase was 2016, 8 years ago. Meanwhile, emerging markets alone added $30 trillion in borrowing since then. COVID relief programs pushed dozens of countries into distress simultaneously. The IMF's firepower remained frozen because quota reform requires 85% approval. The US holds 16.5%, an effective veto. China holds 6.4%, enough to block any increase that doesn't boost its own share. Gridlock. Here's what this means for you. When countries can't access IMF liquidity, they either default, triggering commodity price spikes, supply chain breaks, or seek alternative lenders. Sri Lanka couldn't get fuel. Pakistan faced blackouts. Ghana cut subsidies overnight. So that instability hits US markets through currency volatility and export demand collapse. The failure mechanism is already visible. Argentina is on its 22nd IMF program. Egypt needed a rescue in 2022 and again in 2024. Pakistan has been on life support since 2019. These aren't solutions, they're rollover agreements with austerity conditions so harsh that governments fall. When the institution meant to prevent crises becomes a political death sentence, borrowers seek alternatives. You might be thinking the IMF has handled crises for 75 years. Why would this time be different? Here's the problem: the scale changed. In 1997 Asian financial crisis, the IMF deployed $40 billion to Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea. That was 15% of emerging market debt at the time. Today, deploying 15% would require $15 trillion. The IMF has $650 billion. The math doesn't work anymore. Just like Britain in 1945, sterling balances held £3.5 billion in frozen reserves, believing they owned liquid wealth. Britain didn't discover until the 1949 devaluation that reserves had lost 30% in a weekend. The IMF's nominal capacity masks actual insolvency. The IMF is a distressed asset with a balance sheet mismatch. Stage 2 is where someone noticed. This is stage 2, distressed borrower accumulation. Here's why this matters to you. China is now providing more emergency rescue financing than the IMF, and every rescue comes with governance strings attached. When 30-plus countries depend on Chinese liquidity for basic imports, they vote with China at the UN and give Beijing veto power over who else they borrow from. The accumulation happened in plain sight. Our Belt and Road Initiative was marketed as infrastructure development. What it actually created was a portfolio of 3,000-plus projects across 150 countries, totaling over $1 trillion. Most projects were financed with Chinese loans at commercial rates with short maturities. The business model was never cash flow positive infrastructure. It was vendor financing to create refinancing dependency. Here's how silent accumulation works. You don't announce a grand strategy. You just respond to requests. Sri Lanka wants support? Approved. Pakistan needs power plants? Funded. Each project comes with Chinese contractors, Chinese equipment, Chinese workers. The loans are denominated in dollars, but controlled by Chinese policy banks. Maturities are typically 10 to 15 years with balloon payments. Then COVID hits, commodity prices crash, large tourism collapses. Suddenly, 60-plus countries face simultaneous payment crises. They need emergency liquidity immediately, not in 6 to 18 months after IMF board approval. China's answer, currency swap lines. Immediate access to yuan that can be converted to dollars for critical imports. No austerity requirements. No public program announcements. Just quiet bilateral agreements. Between 2020 and 2023, China deployed an estimated $240 billion in emergency liquidity versus the IMF's $190 billion. The crossover happened and barely made headlines. But here's what it means for you. China is now the lender of first resort for 30-plus countries. When those countries face the choice between Beijing and Washington on trade policy or Taiwan policy, they're already leveraged to Beijing. That shifts everything from rare earth supplies to UN Security Council votes. The swapline network creates a shadow financial system outside Western visibility. Unlike IMF programs, public, scrutinized, audited, Chinese swap lines are bilateral agreements with minimal disclosure. Reporting suggests $550 billion in total capacity across 31 countries. You might be thinking China's lending is different. They're funding real infrastructure, not just bailouts. Here's the problem. The infrastructure mostly doesn't generate enough revenue to service the debt. Sri Lanka's Hambantota port was supposed to handle major shipping traffic. Actual utilization, under 30% of capacity. The port couldn't pay for itself, so Sri Lanka swapped debt for a 99-year lease to China. That's not infrastructure finance, that's asset accumulation. Just like the United States between 1945 and 1949, while Britain bled gold reserves defending sterling, the U.S. quietly positioned dollar swap lines and Marshall Plan vendor financing. By the time Britain realized the extent of U.S. leverage, American bases were permanent. China built a $1 trillion loan portfolio and a $550 billion emergency liquidity network while everyone watched. Stage 3 is where borrowers realize they can't refinance anywhere else. This is Stage 3, refinancing capture. Here's why this matters to you when countries can't refinance debt without Chinese approval. U.S. sanctions lose their teeth. Iran bought oil infrastructure. Venezuela secured food imports. And had the enforcement mechanism for American foreign policy. The threat of being locked out of dollar markets stops working when there's a yuan alternative. The poison pill was supposed to protect the IMF's monopoly. It's called conditionality, the policy reforms countries must accept to access emergency liquidity. Fiscal austerity, subsidy cuts, currency devaluation, privatization of state assets. The economic logic is sound. Countries in crisis need structural adjustment. The political logic is toxic. No government survives telling citizens that fuel subsidies are being cut because the IMF demanded it. China offered a third option, refinancing without public austerity requirements. The conditions still exist, port leases, resource purchase agreements, UN voting alignment, but they're embedded in bilateral agreements, not front-page newspaper demands. The mechanic is elegant. China doesn't need to demand policy changes that trigger protests. They just need to be the only creditor willing to extend maturities during crisis. Once they're the dominant creditor, they have veto power in any restructuring. Other creditors can't force a deal without Chinese participation. Zambia's restructuring took 3 years because China wouldn't accept the same haircut terms as Western lenders. Here's what this means for you. U.S. sanctions increasingly hit American companies harder than target countries. When the U.S. sanctioned Iranian oil in 2018, China kept buying via yuan settlement. Iranian oil found buyers. Chinese refiners got discounted crude. American consumers faced higher gas prices because global supply was artificially constrained. Now, the sanctions worked in theory, but leaked in practice because dollar enforcement requires everyone to use dollar rails. You might be thinking IMF conditionality exists for good reasons. Countries in crisis need reforms, not just more debt. Here's the problem. The reforms may be economically necessary, but they're politically impossible to implement fast enough. Egypt cut fuel subsidies as part of IMF program. Protests erupted immediately. Government restored some subsidies to maintain order. IMF threatened to withhold next tranche. Egypt turned to Chinese swap line for bridge financing. The conditionality became unenforceable because an alternative existed. Just like Britain in the 1960s attempted to defend sterling's reserve status through borrowing from IMF and currency swaps with the US Fed. Each defensive measure required surrendering more policy autonomy. By the 1967 devaluation, Britain retained the symbolism of reserve currency, but lost all meaningful control. Now we have to address the elephant in the room. China's Belt and Road portfolio is massively underwater. Estimates suggest $385 billion or more in non-performing loans. If China demanded full repayment, dozens of countries would default simultaneously, wiping out Chinese capital. China is trapped by its own leverage. It must keep refinancing or accept catastrophic losses. But that trap is also the mechanism of control. Continuous refinancing means continuous negotiations, and continuous negotiations mean continuous governance extraction. We've now completed 3 of 5 stages. The IMF's poison pill became the reason borrowers sought alternatives. Stage 4 is where China converts rescue operations into institutional control. This is Stage 4, governance extraction. We've now completed 4 of 5 stages. Here's why this matters to you. If China increases its IMF voting share from 6.4% to 12% or more, the US loses effective veto power. That means American taxpayer money could be deployed to bail out countries that immediately use those funds to repay Chinese loans. The boardroom coup happens through quota reallocation. IMF voting shares are based on quotas, capital contributions that determine lending capacity and governance control. China's economy is now second largest globally. By the formula, China's quota should be 12 to 15%, not 6.4%. The gap represents $400 billion or more in underrepresented capital. The fix requires 85% approval. The US won't approve unless it maintains veto. China won't contribute more without commensurate voting power, but China doesn't need to win the quota vote directly. They just need to assemble a coalition large enough to block any reform that doesn't favor Chinese interests. Current count, 30-plus countries with active Chinese swap lines or major Belt and Road debt. Combined IMF voting share, approximately 18%. That's enough to block the 85% threshold. The coup isn't taking voting control. It's achieving gridlock that forces more countries into Chinese bilateral arrangements. The second mechanism is the G20 Common Framework for Debt Treatment. China secured co-equal status with the Paris Club in sovereign restructuring negotiations. This means China has veto power over terms if Sri Lanka wants debt relief. China must approve the haircut percentage and maturity extensions. That veto extends to IMF program design. Here's what this means for you. The dollar's role as global reserve currency rests on the IMF's role as lender of last resort enforcing dollar-based adjustment. That enforcement mechanism is breaking. If the IMF becomes gridlocked, there's no institutional pressure to maintain dollar reserve accumulation. Foreign central banks can diversify without consequence. That means weaker treasury demand, higher US borrowing costs, imported inflation. Once China achieves veto power in debt restructuring, every subsequent crisis strengthens their position. Borrowers negotiate with Beijing first. Other creditors must accept Chinese terms or get nothing. The IMF becomes a junior creditor in its own programs. This has already happened in Zambia and Sri Lanka. You might be thinking the US and European nations still control the majority of IMF votes. Here's the problem. Control isn't about majority votes, it's about veto power. The US has 16.5%, Europe has 28% or more, but Europe isn't monolithic. China only needs to peel off 12 to 15% of votes to block any US-led initiative. Belt and Road debtors, Gulf states with Chinese energy relationships, African nations dependent on Chinese infrastructure, that's 15% or more. The coalition exists, just like the United States in 1944. Bretton Woods established IMF with weighted voting. The US secured veto power via 85% threshold. The governance structure locked in American control for 80 years. China is running the same play in reverse. China doesn't need to win the vote, they just need to make the IMF ungovernable. Stage 5 is where the system replacement becomes official. This is Stage 5, system replacement. Here's why this matters to you. When China becomes the de facto lender of last resort, the reserve currency premium that allows the US to borrow at lower rates disappears. That premium is worth an estimated $800 billion annually. Without it, Treasury yields must rise 2% or more. Your mortgage rate rises. Corporate borrowing costs spike. The timeline, 18 to 36 months. The controlling shareholder phase emerges through pattern recognition. Country faces crisis, turns to IMF. IMF program requires 6 months of negotiations and harsh conditionality. Country turns to China, gets bridge financing in 48 hours via swap line. Eventually accepts IMF program to maintain access to Western capital markets, but uses Chinese liquidity to avoid the acute crisis. IMF becomes the institution of record while China provides the actual rescue capital. The system replacement works through parallel infrastructure. The AIIB provides infrastructure refinancing. Yuan swap lines provide emergency dollar access. Belt and Road creates ongoing project pipelines requiring rollover financing. The entire stack replicates IMF functions without IMF governance. Here's the visceral outcome. In 5 years, the majority of sovereign debt restructurings will require Chinese approval. China decides which countries get relief and which face default. Default triggers commodity supply disruptions. Argentina defaults. Soybean exports stop. Zambia defaults. Copper pauses. Pakistan defaults. Textile shipments freeze. Each disruption hits U.S. supply chains and consumer prices. The reserve currency implications cascade. Central banks hold reserves to access emergency liquidity during crises. If that liquidity comes from yuan swap lines instead of IMF programs, why hold dollar reserves? PBOC data shows 25 plus central banks added yuan to reserves in 2023. That number was 8 in 2018. The trend line points to 15 to 20% yuan reserve share by 2030, up from 2 to 3% today. Every percentage point of dollar reserve decline is $500 billion in treasury selling pressure. You might be thinking the yuan isn't credible as a reserve currency. China has capital controls. The bond market is too small. Here's the problem. Reserve currency status doesn't require perfection. It requires being the best available option during crisis. The dollar wasn't perfect in 1944. The US was running wartime inflation, had massive debt. But it was better than sterling. Yuan doesn't need to be better than the dollar in normal times. It just needs to be more accessible during emergencies. Just like 1971, Nixon closed the gold window, ending Bretton Woods. The institutional architecture remained. IMF, World Bank, G7. But the substance changed. Dollar became purely fiat, backed not by gold, but by oil markets and treasury depth. The form persisted while control shifted. China is engineering the same transition for emergency liquidity. The IMF will still exist in 2030, but when the next systemic crisis hits, countries will call Beijing first. That's when everyone realizes the ownership already changed. Same boardroom. Same screens. Different numbers. The yuan swap line count climbs to 35 countries. The voting bloc expands to 20%. The IMF quota reform vote gets delayed another year. The controlling shareholder doesn't need the brass nameplate. They just need countries to know who answers the phone during crisis. The question was never whether China would displace the IMF as lender of last resort. It was whether anyone would notice the transition happened before the final vote. That vote is 18 months out. The transition is already complete.